Hi, and welcome to Synchronicity, talk radio for your mind, body, and soul. I'm your host, Marie Benard, and today we are speaking with Amber O'Hearn. She is a data scientist, writer, and blogger who has been researching and experimenting with ketogenic and evolution-based diets since 1997. Amber has been eating a completely animal-based diet, that means no plant food, for more than 9 years. She has 2 blogs called Empirica and the Ketogenic Diet for Health. Thank you so much for being with us today. Welcome to the show, Amber.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And I just want to give a little bit of a disclaimer here that this interview is not to be taken as medical advice or even a suggestion on what you should eat. Today, we're discussing our experiences and the experiences of some other people who have had experience with a very controversial way of eating. And as with anything, please use your own best discernment and consult with medical professionals whose expertise you trust if you're thinking of making any major lifestyle or dietary changes. Thank you for that. So Amber, I'm curious, you started with a ketogenic based diet back in 1997. So can you just share with us a little bit about your journey that led you to eating this carnivorous diet?
Sure, yes. I was brought up vegetarian, and I had sort of all the mainstream ideas about what constitutes a healthy diet that are still being talked about today, which would be a diet that's high in carbohydrates and including lots of fruits and vegetables and low in fat. And so when I was about 20, I started having weight problems, and that's the first thing that really made me start thinking about wanting to change my diet. But of course, I wanted to improve my health. I didn't want to do anything that would be dangerous to my health. And so the first thing that I started looking into was to really go deeper into the vegetarian and eventually even, I guess they call it plant-based now, but we called it vegan back then, for that kind of dietary approach in order to try to solve my weight problem, which I assumed was, a side effect of ill health. So that didn't work for me. I tried increasing exercise and cutting out meat and eventually all animal products from my diet. And around that time when I was looking for solutions, this was when I first heard of a low-carb diet. I saw it on a forum on the internet. This was back in the 90s, so we didn't have the same kind of fora that you might see now, but we still were talking. And one of them was a forum about low-carb diets. And I took a sort of looked through some of the messages and figured out that they were talking about a diet where, well, it was low in carbohydrates and necessarily high in fat. And I thought that's the craziest, stupidest thing I've ever heard of and promptly dismissed it. But a few years later, when all of my efforts still weren't working, and I happened to take a trip abroad because I was studying Russian, and I had the great fortune to be able to study Russian in Russia, in St. Petersburg. And it wasn't a very vegetarian-friendly place. And I ended up staying with some people in their home and decided it would be better for me to eat what they were eating and have this entire experience and then come home and deal with my health issues later. And the fact is that when I got home, for whatever reason, and it could have been many reasons, frankly, but I did notice that I had lost some weight. And that moment triggered for me a desire to go and look back at the things I'd been hearing about low carb and see if maybe there really was something about that might be true. And so that was 1997, and there had just been a book released by Mike and Mary Dan Eads, who are physicians who had been treating patients using a low carb diet. And they'd written a book about how it works. And it was very scientific, and that really appealed to me. And so I looked up many of their references, found out that there were a lot of misunderstandings that I had about nutritional science, and moreover, when I tried it, it worked beautifully. I lost the weight that had been bothering me, and I felt great. And so that was the beginning of my story and my introduction to a low carbohydrate diet generally.
Beautifully said. Thanks, Amber. And I just want to also put out another disclaimer that we are not suggesting that anyone needs to lose weight. This is a very individual and personal choice, but in your experience, Amber, it seems like that you were noticing that in spite of your best efforts, weight was coming on that you hadn't expected.
That's right. And I do want to clarify that too. A lot of my journey centers around, in certain respects, the desire to lose weight, but it was, that's mainly a vanity issue. There are various measures of health that have nothing to do with weight, and being overweight doesn't necessarily mean that you're unhealthy, but it was, I'll be quite honest, that was the main driver of my discoveries of this health-producing diet, although it's not the main reason that I'm on this diet today, as I hope you'll ask me more about as we go along.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I am curious to know, so you were on a lower carb diet, and then there's so many different types of lower carb diets. There's the ketogenic diet, and today we're kind of here specifically to talk more about some people call it the zero carb diet, or the carnivorous diet. So what was it that moved you towards cutting out all plants completely? And you've been doing it for 9 years and you're still alive.
Yes. Yes, so now there are so many variations of the low carb diet. It's head spinning, really, especially if you're trying to navigate and find out, what am I supposed to do? It can be really confusing. But back then there were fewer things being talked about, and certainly the carnivore diet was not on anybody's radar that I knew of. But what happened to me, and it's funny that you bring up the weight issue, because if you had asked me a couple of years ago, I really would have told my story as a weight story. I would talk about how I did this and my weight went up, and then I did this and my weight went down. And there's another story that happens to be going along in parallel, and the two seem to be quite connected temporally, and I think that there is actually a causal relationship between them. And that's that, along with my issues with weight gain, have been this adulthood-long issue with a psychiatric disorder, a mood disorder. So when I was 20, that was when I first gained weight, when I was in university. That was at the University of Waterloo. And at the same time, that was when I was first diagnosed with depression. And I was put on a Prozac, an SSRI, and that helped kind of a little bit. But then over the course of the next many years, so I had eventually found the low-carb diet, and that actually kind of improved my mood, but it didn't help in any way to the extent that I would be able to stop taking any depressants. And in fact, the depression kept coming back, so they called it major treatment-resistant major depressive disorder was the official label that I had.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean, it basically means we don't know how to fix this. And then two things happened, and I now see them as going together as well. And that's that I don't know if it had to do with changes in hormones from aging or the multiple pregnancies that I went through, but I started to gain weight, and my depressive symptoms got worse. In fact, they changed qualitatively. So I was having this problem with weight gain, partly from the pregnancies that didn't go away when I resumed my regular diet, my regular low-carb diet. Maybe there was an interaction with medication. And then also I was developing symptoms that eventually had me re-diagnosed from major depressive disorder to type 2 bipolar disorder. Type 2 bipolar is like regular bipolar in many ways, except that you don't have psychotic manias. So you have the depression side of it, and you have a kind of reduced, more minor form of mania called hypomania, but it never goes up to the fully manic part that would make it classified as bipolar type 1. Mm-hmm. So I was in this terrible situation where I had these bipolar symptoms. They were getting worse in certain ways. So the cycles, bipolar has this cyclic aspect to it, and the cycles were getting more rapid. They call it rapid cycling. And I was getting what are called mixed states, where instead of alternating between euphoria and despair, you'd get these things like anxiety, irritability. So sort of in the classic bipolar form, when you're having a good mood, you're also having high energy, and when you're having a bad mood, you're also having low energy. But mixed states have this decoupling of the energy from the mood, and so if you have high energy but it's a bad mood, that's going to look more like anxiety or irritation. So these were going on. Actually, when I got re-diagnosed with bipolar, I was really happy, even though it seems like a much more serious kind of disease in certain ways. I was happy because I thought, oh, well, this is why I haven't been able to treat it. We've been using the wrong set of drugs. Mm-hmm. And now that we know what the real problem is, we'll be able to solve it. But that really didn't pan out. And in fact, I tried, 4 or 5 different bipolar medications. None of them gave me any relief from the symptoms, and they all had different terrible side effects, each one worse than the next. It was really, really terrible. And I didn't know what I was going to do, and all this was going on. And it was in the context of this bipolar and weight gain situation when I happened upon a forum on the internet called Zeroing In on Health, in which there were people who were in a similar situation to me, in that they were on a low-carb diet, but it wasn't really getting them to the full weight loss goals that they wanted to meet. And they had tried this diet, which they were calling zero carb, which meant it didn't really mean literally zero carb, because there are things that have no carbohydrates, like olive oil, for example, which would still be a plant food. And then there are things like eggs, which have a very small amount of carbohydrate in them. So there isn't really a perfect name, but they were calling it that. And a lot of people were finding that they were able to get much better results on this zero carb diet than a low carb diet. And I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose. I could try this for a few weeks and see how it goes. And then if it works for me, then when I get down to my maintenance or to my goal weight, I can use low carb again, and maybe I'll be able to maintain better this time around. So my whole idea in approaching it was that it was going to be very temporary, and that it was really just all about weight loss again.
Mm-hmm. So then what did you notice, though? It was you went into it for the weight loss, but you're still on it after 9 years.
Yeah, so I tried it, and I had planned this 3-week thing where it was going to end on my 36th birthday, and then I was going to have a piece of low-carb cake, and I was going to reassess and see where I was. But within 2 weeks, probably less than 2 weeks, just started feeling really good in a way that I couldn't quite put my finger on. My mood was great, and my husband at the time noticed it too, and in fact we sat down and had this very serious moment in which he said, I haven't really known how to bring this up to you, but over the last couple of weeks, your mood has been better and more stable than I can ever remember it being. And We'd been together for 10 years at that point or something. And so, you've got this long-term disease and you're not going to say you're cured of it after 2 weeks of a good mood. But on the other hand, it was very motivating to keep going because I didn't want to lose that. And so I didn't end up having that low-carb birthday cake, and my plan was to just do this indefinitely for a while. And also, as a bonus, at this point it's just a bonus that the weight started dropping off, and that was really great because I was at that point almost 200 pounds, and I'm 5'6", and it was just really uncomfortable. So there was a bit of a jagged route here because very soon after that birthday, I got pregnant again for the third time. And I had every intention, actually, of carrying through this diet through the pregnancy. I'd already been researching low-carb diets and felt quite comfortable with the safety of those for pregnancy. But what happened was I have this hereditary condition called hyperemesis gravidarum. And it's when you get pregnant, you get so sick that you can't keep anything down. Many people actually have to be hospitalized while they're pregnant in order to stay hydrated and to keep nourished. Fortunately, I never had it as badly as my mother and her mother and many of the other females in my family, but it was enough that I basically started eating whatever I felt I could keep down, and that wasn't meat. So I was a little disappointed, but it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. By the end of the pregnancy, I was ready to try this again because it had had such a profound effect. After my third son was born, I immediately went back on the all-meat diet, and that was at the end of October in 2009, and I've been on it ever since. I never had to take another psychiatric medication. I've had ups and downs, that's for sure, but nothing like clinical depression, nothing like bipolar disorder. It's just been a complete life changer for me.
Wow. We are speaking right now with Amber O'Hearn. She is a data scientist, writer, and blogger who has been eating a completely animal-based, no plant food diet for more than 9 years. You can find one of her blogs at empiri.ca. EMPIRI.ca. Thanks for being with us, Amber, and thanks for sharing that experience. So you were basically able to go completely off your psychiatric meds. Again, this is not to be taken as medical advice. This is Amber talking about her own personal experience. So what other things have you noticed? Because I know that depression has been linked to inflammation in the body. And I know that I've been dabbling with this carnivorous diet and having some challenges with it. And I know that when I am eating, if I have a day where I eat refined carbohydrates, as an example, not only will the scale go up, but I can feel there's inflammation in my body that happens. And so that's one of the benefits for myself of eating either a ketogenic diet or an all animal-based diet, is that the inflammation has decreased. But what other things have you noticed in addition to improved mood and no longer needing the psychiatric medication?
One thing that happened was I had acquired rosacea, which is a skin condition of the face. It took me a long time to figure out what it was. I didn't know about it. And what happens is your face flushes, sometimes from just very mundane things like exercise or changes in temperature, or perhaps in connection with having a drink of alcohol or something. It's not that uncommon for someone's face to flush. But with rosacea, the face kind of stays flushed. And I was getting to the point where it looked like I had a perpetual sunburn. So my face was just red and inflamed all the time. And when I went on a zero-carb diet, that's one of the things that that went away. I almost never flush now. You said that I'm on a plant-free diet, and I just want to have a full disclosure. I still drink coffee. When I started this diet, it didn't occur to me that coffee would be disruptive. And because I was able to get all these results without quitting coffee, I've mostly kept it. Although because my curiosity got the better of me, thinking, if coffee is a plant-based product, so what would happen if I took it out? And mercifully, nothing happened. So I brought it back because I enjoy it.
I actually, can I ask you about that? Because I love my coffee too, and I did cut it out for a week or two, and I didn't notice any changes. But how long should someone, well, I know we're not giving medical advice, but how long did you cut it out before you realized this is fine, either I can take it or leave it?
Well, I've done it twice. Once was, it was several years after. It was in 2015, and I did it for a month. And then just last year, I decided to try it again, and I did it for the full 3 months of summer from the solstice until the equinox. So I think probably 3 months is more than enough to know if it's not going to have an effect. Maybe a month is a good amount of time.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, as with anything, different people respond to different things. So what works for one person might not work for another. But so one of the things I started this zero carb back last summer when I knew that I was going to be taking part in an elimination diet specifically for dealing with mood issues, inflammation, pain, and depression. And so I just started cutting everything out because I knew I was going to have to anyway. And I have, for the most part, stuck with it. I occasionally eat some plant food, and I have been, as I hear people talking, this is a very controversial way of eating, and there's not a lot of studies to back up the safety of it. So every time I hear someone talking about how potentially dangerous it is, I start to reconsider, maybe I should be doing more. And what I find is, I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like I kind of either need to be on a high plant diet with moderate meat or no plants, because the ketogenic for me wasn't working as well with having some plant food. Like I was having on the keto, I was keto for quite a while, and I was always having problems with constipation, no matter how much fiber I took. And in fact, taking more fiber actually made it worse. And when I switched to eating all meat, that actually cleared up within a couple of weeks. But whenever I introduce another plant food, it starts to mess me up again.
Right. Yeah. So, well, let me just loop back for a second. The reason I brought up the coffee as this exception that I've been making is because I was talking about rosacea, and one thing that I've noticed that will make my rosacea flare is decaf coffee, but not regular coffee. And so that really speaks to the fact that there is some individuality in terms of people and what plant compounds they can individually tolerate and what's going to trigger their issues. So when you say we're doing this elimination, and did I understand you correctly when you were saying that when you took all the plant foods out, you were doing okay, but when you started trying to reintroduce them, that's when you were running into trouble?
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily noticing any reactions like inflammation or anything like that, but I noticed that constipation issues returned when I started introducing some plant food here and there. I mean, I do drink coffee, but that's pretty much the only thing. And I've kind of been trying to, because every time I hear an interview about how dangerous this way of eating is, and then I start to get worried and I try to change my diet back. But I actually, one of the benefits for me is it's just, you don't have to constantly be planning out what you're going to eat. It's just like, I'm just eating whatever meat is on sale that I like.
It's really hard to overstate that effect. The fact that you can eat so simply just frees up all this mental energy. And it's really, I think you can't even understand how much mental energy goes into thinking about food until you take away that aspect and see how much time you actually have to think about other things.
Yeah.
It's funny. Fiber has this reputation of being needed for bowel movements and being helpful with constipation. But if you look at the research, it's conflicted at best. There are as many studies, if not more, showing that fiber makes constipation worse than improves it. So I really don't think that the studies are very definitive about that. So I think maybe it may be the fiber. A lot of people that are doing a carnivorous diet are actually doing it not because of mood, but because of digestive issues specifically. And the fiber may actually be one of the main culprits in that.
Mm-hmm. So again, we are speaking with Amber O'Hearn. She's a data scientist, writer, and blogger. She's been eating an almost completely animal-based diet for more than 9 years. And if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
I'm very responsive on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Keto Carnivore. But you can also leave me comments on my blogs, the ones that you've already mentioned.
Wonderful. Thank you. So as a data scientist, there's not a lot of studies that have been done on this way of eating, but I imagine you are scouring for evidence. So what kind of evidence, other than your own personal experience, have you found in favor of eating this way?
Well, there are basically 3 kinds of evidence. One is just sheer anecdotes, and that is that over the last couple of years in particular, a lot more people have been trying this diet. Even way back when I started it 10 years ago, there were people who were on the fora who were talking about these extra benefits that they were seeing that they didn't expect, because many of them, like me, were just really in it for the vanity. But then they'd find, hey, I just realized that I haven't used my asthma inhaler for a couple of weeks, or my arthritis pain has gone away. So there are these unexpected benefits that a lot of people are seeing. But, anecdotes come with a lot of problems. There's a lot of confusion about how valuable they can be. And one of the problems that we have currently is that even if you have people who are trying it for a few months or even a couple of years, it doesn't really speak to the whole picture of what would happen in making this a lifestyle. So the second kind of question that you might want to know about if you embark on a diet, and you're in a position like me where it's unquestionably, you found something that's unquestionably giving you a better quality of life in the present, but you don't know what the long-term consequences of it are. And that's a very serious question. So you want to know, is it safe? And one thing that I started looking at when I first found myself in this position was, well, what is the evidence that we need to have fruits and vegetables in our diet? And I started looking at it. And as a data scientist, I can see that the evidence behind it is almost all of a certain kind, which is called epidemiology, in which scientists take a whole bunch of data that says like that there are all these people that eat this way for a long time, and then what are the outcomes that eventually happen. And these kinds of studies they're really useful for developing hypotheses about what might be going on, but they're really a big pitfall if you use them to try to prove causality, because they're just not set up in a way that could give us information about causality. So, for example, if you had a whole bunch of data that said, wow, it seems like the more gray hair you have, the more likelihood you're going to die in the next 20 years. you can't say that the gray hair is causing death. I mean, it's a fine hypothesis, but I don't think it's going to stand up to further study. So almost all of the evidence that we have on whether or not fruits and vegetables are good for you comes from this kind of epidemiological data where we're saying, oh, it looks like people who are eating more fruits and vegetables are having better health outcomes. But there's so many reasons that that could be the case. For one thing, people who are eating more fruits and vegetables are probably eating less refined junk food. Not only that, but people who are eating more fruits and vegetables tend to be the kind of people who do what doctors say in order to take care of their health. So they're more likely to exercise, they're less likely to smoke. So we get all these confounds. It's just not a very strong kind of data. So that's where the majority of our information about plant foods come. And the big problem with it is that none of it is in the context of a low-carb diet. And it turns out that a low-carb diet has so many characteristics that are different from a high-carb diet, not just nutritionally, but metabolically speaking. So when you're deriving most of your energy from carbohydrates, your metabolism is operating in one way. Your cells are burning glucose for energy, and all these pathways are activated. When you go on a low-carb diet, most of your energy is actually coming from fat. And that turns on a whole bunch of other metabolic pathways that aren't normally there in a high-carb diet. And so suddenly all kinds of things like ranges of normal values for different hormones in your system, or even how much of different nutrients you need can change. So it's a bit frustrating, but it's also a little bit exciting to realize that we're in a state where we don't know a lot about what the long-term consequences of this kind of diet will be, but we know that we can't use the prior data and apply it to ourselves either. We're kind of pioneers.
That brings up a question I have, and you may or may not know the answer to this, and he's not here to speak up for himself, but there's a Dr. Sean Baker who's been doing this all-meat carnivorous diet, and he's very athletic. He got some blood tests done, and his blood sugar was actually quite high, and that scares me because my mom had diabetes. And so I'm wondering what kind of research you've done around that, or if you're aware of that issue.
Yes, I am. One interesting thing that happens on low-carb diets is it usually normalizes blood sugar. That is, people who had blood sugar that was high, they were diabetic or pre-diabetic, that tends to go down and be normalized. My own blood sugar is usually, well, I'm using American units, but in the 70 to 90 range, which is quite normal. And most people who are on low carb and carnivorous diets have that same result. But some people, and they're almost always athletic people, get a slightly higher baseline of glucose that would be more around the 100 level, which is sort of borderline pre-diabetic, and it does worry some people. But I think that we're seeing this in a specific population, and it may have a particular reason. It's been given a name. It's associated with something called physiological insulin resistance, which means that you're making so little glucose that your body kind of spares the use of it and lets it get a little bit higher. I can't say for sure because we don't have the medical interventional trials that we would like to have to say for sure. But my understanding is that if your blood sugar is a little bit higher and you're athletic, so there's a good reason for it, but it's stable, so you're not having these wild swings, you're not having huge postprandial, post-meal blood sugar levels, then it's probably not a worry. But the bottom line is this doesn't happen to everybody, and it's something we need to learn more about.
Thanks, Amber. I have so many questions, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to invite you on the show, is because I have experience with this myself, and I want to ask someone with so much more experience and with your background in science. And I totally forgot what I was just going to say, but I also want to share this because a lot of people are noticing really important health benefits. But for myself, I haven't, I went into it partly for the weight loss as well. And in my experience, I only get the weight loss when I'm intermittent fasting as well. And that's one of the kind of rules of the zero carb, is that people don't fast. So I'm wondering what your opinion is on that.
Yeah, that's a funny one. There are a few controversies in the carnivore sphere. So historically, in this zero carb culture, we had a lot of people, the majority of people were drawn to it because of weight loss. And a lot of people had this long history of either frank eating disorders or at least a very unhealthy relationship with food. And one of the things that the community was trying to emphasize was that when you feed your body the food that it is adapted to eat and that is healthy for it, you don't have to restrict calories, because your appetite is going to start regulating. And so there is a very strong discouragement from restricting calories in any way, in part to try to encourage a healthier relationship with food. Moreover, in the theory, the most prevalent theory about how low-carb diets in general work is that when you take away the carbohydrate, one of the things that happens is, because you haven't introduced all this glucose into your bloodstream, your insulin levels are going to come down. And when your insulin levels come down, that allows it signals to your fat tissue that you can release fat and start using it. And so if you're eating fewer calories, well, let me put it this way. If you're on a low-carb diet and you have calories to spare on your body, what should theoretically naturally happen is that when your insulin goes lower, suddenly the fat from your fat tissue is going to be able to come out and be released. And when that happens, you're not going to feel hungry, and because you've got access to all the energy that you need. So if you're eating a low-carb diet and you're hungry, that suggests that either there's something going wrong, so you're not able to actually access that fat the way that you're supposed to be, or you actually need something, like you need some protein, or you even need some energy, or you need some nutrients. And so there's also a very strong cultural encouragement to listen to your body when it tells you that it's hungry. And so that, I guess that's reason number 2. Reason number 3 that fasting is often discouraged in the zero carb community is that some people have found that when they're on a ketogenic diet, they just never quite feel as good as they do when they're fasting. And so people think they need to fast to feel better. But the idea in the zero carb community is that the reason that they're feeling better when they fast either comes from enhanced ketogenesis, or it comes from removing those inflammatory foods. And if you're on a zero carb diet, you've already removed those inflammatory foods, so fasting should be theoretically unnecessary. So that's why you might get pushback in the zero carb community. I think that if you're on a zero carb diet, you could still be overeating for reasons that don't have to do with your appetite, reasons to do with habit or just cultural things that are happening that cause you to want to eat. And if you don't give your body a break from time to time, it could actually be detrimental. So I think it can be worth trying to fast or eat a little less. Although I have to say I do have great sympathy for the idea that if it's feeling bad, that is, if you feel hungry, for example, I tried intermittent fasting a few times over the last year. I did a few one-day fasts, and there were 3 times I was going to do a 5-day fast, and each time I tried it, on the 4th day, I just felt terrible. I felt tired, I felt freezing cold, and I felt hungry. And I said, you know what? Obviously, the fat isn't flowing, or I wouldn't feel like this. And so I allowed myself to eat. So with that caveat, I do think it's important to not make yourself go hungry. But then again, giving yourself a little space between meals is probably a good thing too.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Amber. So again, I want to give out that disclaimer that this interview is not to be taken as medical advice or even a suggestion on what you should eat. We're just talking about our experiences and the experiences of other people who have self-reported their experience with eating a carnivorous diet. So for me, I kind of feel, other than the constipation though, I don't feel a ton of difference between the ketogenic diet and the zero carbs. So there are still some health issues that I have that I'm assuming are related to inflammation that are still present, whether I'm eating zero carb or ketogenic. So I'm reading about all these other people who are having amazing health results, and I don't feel like I've experienced the same thing. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I guess I have a couple of questions. When you say it's plant-free, are you continuing to eat spices or take supplements?
I've done a little bit of both. I find that I do better without spices. I have started taking vitamin D because my vitamin D levels were extremely low, and I sometimes take magnesium and sometimes I don't. I started taking it again when I started to try and incorporate some more plant food, and I've kind of kept up with that. But when I first started zero carb, I wasn't doing any plant food at all.
Okay.
Oh, except coffee, though.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One thing that you might be interested in trying is more of a combination of carnivore and keto. So if you do a carnivorous diet, it's low carb and you're very likely to have some level of ketosis. Almost everybody has some level of ketosis, but it's usually low. But you can combine them in such a way that you're purposefully trying to make it more ketogenic by eating a lot more fat compared to protein. There is a group in Hungary. They used to be called Paleomedicina, but they've changed their name to the International Center for Medical Nutritional Therapy, I think. I don't think I have that exactly right. ICMNI. But they advocate a very ketogenic version of a carnivore diet for people that they are treating in their clinic with chronic diseases. And I've only played around with that version of it a little bit, so I'm not an expert on that way of eating, but I know that some people get better results with that.
Thank you. I have dabbled with that, and I find I find that I do get better results when I focus on being more ketogenic without the plant matter. So I guess it's going to take some dabbling. And then all of just the fear, there's a lot of fear-based stuff around everything these days, right? And especially around what we eat and how we take care of our health. And there's so many conflicting studies and opinions out there. So it really takes time. I'm curious to know how often you get your blood tested.
At first, I didn't. Partly it was a cost issue, and partly I was of a mindset which I've now kind of backtracked on, which is that if I get some results that are that don't look like what the mainstream doctors want to see. Like I'm not going to change what I'm doing, so who cares? But I am a data scientist, and I am curious, and I want to know, even if this diet turns out to be really healthy, what it's going to be interesting to know what the differences are in terms of blood work. So I had my first one done when I was already 4 years into the diet, and then I didn't do it again for about 5 years, and now I've had blood taken maybe 4 or 5 times in the last 6 months for various experiments, and partly under the influence of a good friend of mine named Siobhan Huggins, who does a lot of research with a group called the Cholesterol Code, which their purpose really is to dive into the blood markers, particularly cholesterol, but other things about the low-carb diet, and find out what's actually going on.
And so how have you been satisfied with the results? I mean, you're still eating this way, so.
Yes. So almost everything in my blood work would be happy, would make a conventional doctor happy. So I have very low triglycerides, very high HDL. Both of those are good risk markers for cardiovascular disease. I have extremely low markers of inflammation. So CRP is always under 1, usually under 0.3. Last time I measured it was under 0.15. I've had a couple other inflammatory markers measured, and they're also low. The one thing that conventional doctors don't like is that my LDL is very high. And that's actually to be expected. Most people on low-carb diets have very high LDL. And it's controversial, but from all of the studies that I've looked at, it actually isn't a very good marker of heart disease despite the claims. So if you go back to the actual studies that, like, they're epidemiology also, but they take all these people and measured all their blood and then looked at them years later and found out how many of them had heart attacks. LDL is a really poor marker, especially compared to triglycerides and HDL. So I'm not worried about it. Some people might be.
Fair enough. Thank you. So I just want to be mindful of time. We have a few minutes left. We're speaking right now with Amber O'Hearn. You can find her on Twitter at Keto Carnivore, or one of her blogs is Empirica, which is empiri.ca. And let's talk for a moment, because the biggest thing that's most obvious to everybody is, what about vitamin C?
Yeah, vitamin C is a funny thing. It's interesting because there are a lot of people like me who have been eating an all-meat diet for a long time and not taking extra vitamin C, and yet we didn't get scurvy. Now, to be, full disclosure, it hasn't been the case that I've been free of vitamin C the whole 9+ years that I've been carnivore. There were a couple of periods where I took some, but I certainly was without supplements for much, much longer than it would take scurvy to develop. But I've looked into this particular issue of vitamin C actually quite extensively because it's so fascinating to me. Why would this happen? You have the theory, and then you have the actual observations, and the observations are that people on this diet aren't getting scurvy. Well, it turns out that we've known this for centuries because, not necessarily about eating an all-meat diet, but it's been known for centuries that meat is an anti-scorbutic. That is, it cures scurvy. So there were sailors in the late 1800s who went on trips and found that if they ate fresh meat, it couldn't be dried canned meat, but if you eat fresh meat, it cures scurvy. So there were arguments about this in the journal The Lancet from the 19th century that are interesting to read. It was basically the same discussion we're having right now, like, how is this possible? Because it doesn't fit with our theory. But there are a few reasons that this might be. One reason is that meat does actually have some vitamin C in it. If you go to a regular database like nutrition data or the USDA database, and you look up beef and the vitamin C content, it says 0, which is perplexing. But if you go back to the reports, everything that they have in that database has an accompanying report, and you can see what they measured and what methods they used to measure it. And it turns out that they didn't measure it. They have this key for it. I think it's key value number 7. Measurement type number 7 is assumed 0. So they actually didn't measure it. They just assumed that it was 0. There is some vitamin C in muscle meat. Granted, it's not a lot, but if you look at how much we think of vitamin C you need to prevent scurvy, you can get that much in about 1.5 to 2 pounds of meat. So a carnivore, if you're eating carnivore diet, you're eating about that much meat, you should be getting your antiscorbutic dose. That's one thing, but it's only kind of barely adequate. So it seems like it's not the whole answer. And there are a couple other answers that I've come up with in researching this topic. One has to do with being on a low-carb diet. And that is, and Gary Taubes talked about this in his book, it turns out that that glucose and vitamin C compete for uptake in cells in the bloodstream. So if your glucose is normally lower, then it stands to reason that more vitamin C can get into your cells. Another thing about ketogenic diets is that one of the roles that vitamin C plays is to act as an antioxidant. It really has 2 main roles. One is to produce 2 compounds, collagen and carnitine, and the other is as an antioxidant. And when you're on a low-carb ketogenic diet, the endogenous antioxidants, the ones that you make yourself in your body, actually go up. And so there's some reason to believe that that aspect of our need for vitamin C would go down. And then finally, I mentioned that one of the main purposes or functions of vitamin C is to create carnitine. Carnitine is a really important amino acid that is used in order to transport fatty acids into the mitochondria so you can burn them for energy. If you don't have that, or if you're low in carnitine, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to feel really tired. Well, it turns out that the first symptom of scurvy, long before your teeth fall out, is that you get really, really tired. But carnitine is called carnitine because it was found first in meat. Meat is extremely rich in carnitine. So one of the reasons that I think that explains why vitamin C is so not an issue on a carnivore diet is that you're eating meat, you're getting all this carnitine that relieves the body of the need to make as much, and then it leaves more vitamin C left over for the remaining functions.
So kind of the same as the time thing. When you don't have to think so much about what you're eating, it just frees up all this other energy to do stuff.
Yes.
Cool. Well, we are pretty much out of time. I have so many more questions for you, but we're out of time for today. We have been speaking with Amber O'Hearn. You can find her on Twitter at Keto Carnivore or her blog empiri.ca. Is there anything else you want to add before we close the show today?
Yeah, there's one more thing. Because of my interest in this diet, I decided this year to run a conference that was only about the carnivore diet and the science behind it. And so I had that conference in March. It was a day long here in Boulder, Colorado. And the videos from that conference will be released to the public starting this week. And so if you're interested in more of the science behind this diet, I welcome you to watch some of the videos and see what some of the scientists that I invited had to say about it.
Oh, beautiful. Where are those videos going to be available?
They'll be on YouTube.
And what is your channel on YouTube? Or what the channel where you can find them?
The playlist is going to be called Carnivorecon 19, and the channel is just my own name, L. Amber O'Hearn.
Carnivorecon 19 playlist on YouTube. Thank you so much. I will definitely be watching those videos. And thank you to Amber O'Hearn for being with us today. And thank you for listening. I hope that you found this valuable. And remember, this was not meant to be taken as medical advice. Please consult with a medical professional whose expertise you trust. And always go in and check with your own discernment, because we have to be responsible for making our own health choices no matter what anyone else says. So thank you so much for being with us today. I want to send you so much love. Be well. Namaste.